Welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast. Today I'd like to talk about one of the most important figures in the Bible, especially the New Testament, that you probably haven't heard a lot about, but really tells us a lot about how Paul worked with women. And that's Phoebe in Romans 16, 1 and 2. Now, those are the only verses that mention her by name. But what you see is you see her influence throughout. It also tells us a tremendous amount about how women worked with Paul in ministry. And of course, this is one of the main arguments for saying that women should be in ministry. We're supported in the New Testament as ministers, apostles, deacons, and so forth. But it really kind of goes deeper than that, because a lot of the research that's gone on in recent decades is about the role of women in the New Testament and how they were absolutely crucial in the spread of Christianity. You really see this, and there's lots of clues. Like I often tell people who, when they're reading their Bibles, they say, the most interesting parts are often the stories and the narratives. And, don't be too upset if you get bogged down and, not really wanting to read like the genealogies or the greetings, salutations, and so forth. But this is often where biblical scholars get the most information. It's in those sort of long, boring passages. Romans 16 is an example of that because it's just a long list of greetings, gratitude that Paul has for his co-workers in the gospel, but it's just an absolute goldmine for how Paul worked with people, and about how this most important letter of Paul, Romans, was absolutely crucial to his mission. And the most important person in this, there are many that are, but most important person in this is right up front, and that is Phoebe. Because Phoebe was the letter carrier, and you can tell by the way that Paul is introducing Phoebe to the Romans, and how he describes her. So, and then that really gives us a lot of the background. And then where the research comes in is that when you look at the other women in the New Testament and you look at cultural history, what the role that women played, especially rich widows, and that's a crucial fact here. It's almost certain that Phoebe was a rich widow by the way she is described and what she did in here. And then how that was crucial to the spread of Christianity and house churches, that house churches probably would not have happened, and the spread of Christianity wouldn't have happened in the way that it did, or maybe at all, without these women supporting it. There's a lot of parallels to today's churches. Where would the church be, the Christian churches be, without women supporting it? I mean, virtually every church, whether they're very patriarchal churches or churches that fully include women, either the very egalitarian churches, they all depend very much on both the work of women, the emotional and financial support of women. So it's kind of like, what else is new? So let me start with Romans 16, 1 and 2. I'll describe a little bit about Phoebe, and then I'll go on and we'll talk about a few other characters in this and kind of the role that they played, but then also talk about how sort of the language history of this and some clues that come from there and some of the research that goes on with this. So starting with verse 1, I am introducing our sister Phoebe to you, who is a deacon, servant. Many of the translations that we look at say who is a servant. Servant and deacon are the same, but most often people today associate that word with servant with a very particular word in Greek, which is also the word for slave. It's definitely not that. She's a deaconion, which means a deacon. She's a deacon of the church in Cenchrea. I'll describe where Cenchrea is. Cenchrea is next to Corinth, and it's a very crucial fact, that location. Welcome, this is verse 2. Welcome her in the Lord, in a way that is worthy of God's people, and give her whatever she needs from you, because she herself has been a sponsor, which is also a word for benefactor, of many people, myself included. In those two verses are just a huge number of clues. First of all, like I said, deacon. We tend to think of a deacon, especially say in the Catholic Church, for example, a deacon is a very a very elevated position. But it's also in most churches the servants of the people. So they're the arm of the church that runs charities, that reaches out and finds people, that does the communion, does all kinds of things, and that's what this description is there. The next clue is the church in Cenchrea. Now, Cenchrea is right next to Corinth, like I mentioned, about 5 miles to the east of Corinth. Corinth is on the very end of a long inlet, bay, almost looks like a fjord in Greece, and then there's a 5-mile isthmus, 5-mile wide isthmus that connects the Peloponnesian Peninsula to the rest of Greece. And then on the and Corinth is at the very head there, and on the east side of that isthmus is Cenchrea. And why this is so important is that in order to avoid a 200-mile detour around the Peloponnesian Peninsula, merchants would often go up this channel, and then they would deliver their goods in Corinth. And this, of course, once the distance, 200 miles in those days was probably a week of travel, right? So there's time. But also, when you go around the bottom of Greece, you're in open water. And you can get a lot of storms. You can get there's a lot of shipwrecks and things like that. It's just a more treacherous way to go. So if you can offload your goods in Corinth, if you're going toward the east, or if you can offload your goods in Cenchrea, if you're headed toward the west, then it's a 5-mile basically train, carts and horses and whatnot, to get your goods over the isthmus, or just to be sent throughout Greece from that point. So you can see this is a very important sort of choke point in history. Today, there's actually a canal that was carved through there in the 1890s. It's too small for commercial shipping today, but they recognized the value of that canal, which was just a major feat of engineering, because it was cutting through hundreds of feet of rock in order to get through. But and you can go through it on cruise ships today, on small cruise ships, of course. But that is just, it's still a choke point right there. And in the ancient times, there was any commerce that was coming from Asia Minor, Turkey, the Eastern Mediterranean, Israel, Syria, whatever, and going to Italy, especially up the Adriatic Sea, or going to Venice in particular, had to either go around the Peloponnesian Peninsula or go through Cenchrea, Corinth. So that's where their wealth came from. Now, Phoebe, it's very important that Paul mentions Cenchrea here for that reason. Because here's Phoebe, and there's no man mentioned with Phoebe. If Phoebe had a husband that was alive, then they would almost certainly, Paul would have mentioned the husband probably first in most cases, and along with Phoebe, because husbands are always mentioned with the woman. So it's a very strong clue that since we see Phoebe alone, that she was a widow. She certainly had wealth. You can't be a benefactor. You can't be a servant in the way that he talks about um, without having wealth. Uh, she's certainly literate because she's carrying the letter. You don't just carry the letter; you read the letter. When the population you're speaking to is 80 to 90% illiterate, you can't just leave copies around. Remember, there's no printing press. So what you would do is Paul would entrust readers to take these letters, the ones that we're very familiar with, the epistles, and he would then commission them to go out and to read the letter. So we know that Phoebe had to have been literate. The other thing about this is that she also had to, not only a benefactor for the mission and for the church, she had to have been personally wealthy too in order to be able to travel like that as a single woman. Now, again, it would not be safe for a single woman to travel alone. There really wasn't much of a means to do that. So there had to have been an entourage, guards, companions, whatever, to go with her, and that all takes money. You have to pay for the travel. You have to pay for food, for just everything. So there's money involved, and this is a kind of a clue about Paul in his letters, and sending people out, and he's reaching out to all these people around, and he's mentioning them. Then that also takes means. So they needed to have donors, benefactors, in order to be able to support the mission, to be able to travel, to be able to collect alms, for the poor and things like that. So clearly Phoebe's one of those. Another thing that I found very interesting in recent years is that I had a parishioner who actually said, Pastor Rob, this Phoebe character, she had to have known Latin, right? And I thought about that and I go, that's incredible that you said that, because you're right. Phoebe's talking in home churches. She's carrying a letter written in Greek, because she's from Greece, written in Greek, and she is talking about it in Rome. Now, there were certainly Greek readers and Greek speakers in Rome as well, because Greek was the lingua franca, especially of the Mediterranean at the time. But whenever you're talking about who she's talking to, she's not only talking to heads of household or people who were real educated. She's talking to a lot, everybody. Probably reading in these house churches with slaves there, of slaves of all different levels, of to serve other kinds of servants, to brethren who were not head of household, to women and wives and so forth. So in order to be able to speak the gospel, which is what Paul wanted in these house churches, to speak the gospel, she had to have spoken it in Latin. And that, that sounds kind of absurd, doesn't it? A little bit. So I spoke to one of my professors who's an expert in the glossia, and has written some amazing literature about the idea of speaking in tongues and the spirit and the glossia. And he goes, what is really interesting is the use of language and the different languages and interpretations happening in the Mediterranean at this time. So I asked him a little bit about it. I go, I have a parishioner that thinks that Phoebe spoke Latin. He goes, oh yeah, definitely. I go, really? How are you so sure? He says, well, Phoebe is obviously a rich widow. Obviously, has to be connected. If Paul's sending her out on a mission, she has to be politically connected. She has to be able to travel safely and so forth. And she goes, women, wealthy widows, heads of household in Greece, were interacting with the courts, with the law, with government, in a lot, right? Well, all of that throughout the Roman Empire occurred in Latin. So lawyers and politicians and people of power, and especially any part of the government, anywhere in the Roman Empire, had to know Latin because the written instructions were in Latin, the law was in Latin, and court proceedings and things like that were in Latin. Isn't that interesting? Because that's kind of like the way it is today. I mean, Latin is very much part of the law in all Western countries, even today. So, that's a legacy that we have. Well, that was true at that time too. So I thought that was fascinating. So who is this darn woman? I mean, she's multilingual, she's rich, she's literate. She has to be smart enough and trusted enough by Paul to interpret this letter. The letter to the Romans was Paul's most important letter, and was certainly even recognized at the time. Probably came somewhat later. Now, we think of it as a big theological document, for our purposes. I've spoken a lot, and, I'll speak more about this, is that it's probably just as much about reconciliation between different factions, just like Galatians is, or other letters, maybe even more about that than it is about grand theology, which we use it for. But still, no matter what it is, it has a purpose. Paul couldn't get to Rome, but the churches in Rome needed his support, and he entrusts this to Phoebe to carry it, to interpret it, and to speak it in the churches. So this woman had to have been very important. So anybody who thinks that Paul's a misogynist or doesn't rely on women, it just isn't looking at the facts here. The other part of this is very interesting too. There's been a lot of research in recent years about cultural history in the Roman Empire and how it relates to Christianity. There's Christianity definitely grew because of women. Paul is listed. There are 18 different women in the New Testament that worked with Paul. That doesn't include, women like Mary Magdalene and others, but, the bulk, of course, of the women were working with Paul. And so clearly he had to rely on them. There's, and probably, likely, especially if you see them alone, listed alone, like Lydia, for example, Phoebe and others, they probably are widows. And the reason for this is that a very interesting cultural bit here. Under Roman law, if a woman or if a woman's husband died and he was head of household, she would become the proxy. She would become the head of household, the replacement head of household for a time. And the idea is that she would inherit the wealth. She would control the family until she could find a new husband. And there was tremendous pressure on these women to remarry because, the Roman Empire was a very patriarchal culture. There are certainly subcultures within Roman society that weren't quite as patriarchal, maybe like Ephesus sometimes is spoken of having women leadership and so forth. But for the most part, Roman imagery, Roman literature is very, very masculine, right? So there's a lot of pressure on these women in order to engage with Roman society. They needed to get remarried. They needed to be associated with a man. But you can imagine, and there were a lot of them because usually because of age difference, that men would marry women somewhat younger, not hugely younger, but it's, head of household especially, who had inherited everything and, may pick a younger woman as his mate or have that woman chosen for him, more likely. And so there might be an age difference, not uncommon, not even uncommon what you see today of, 5 to 10 years. Well, just like today, too, is that Roman men didn't live as long as women on average. especially if they had wealth and and means. So you had a lot of women that were likely in their 40s, maybe late 30s, 40s, around, that were these widows. The Christian church offered them an opportunity to resist remarrying. This is the subtext of a lot of Paul's writing about marriage. That you see especially in Corinthians chapter 7, for example, or 1 Corinthians chapter 7. You see it a little bit in Ephesians. We're not sure if Ephesians is Pauline or not, but if we assume that it is, a lot of the language in there is about the role of women in marriage. And Paul urges celibacy, and Paul urges that throughout. That's not a Roman concept at all. No, they didn't like that. Men didn't want their women to be celibate. They wanted their women to produce offspring, right? And that was true in celibacy was definitely not part of the Jewish culture either. In Judaism, there's a lot of pressure to produce offspring, and for women to be married and produce offspring. So in Christianity, though, and we see this resulting in a lot of other aspects of Christianity later on, especially celibacy is an important aspect of Christianity, both for men and for women. So part of that likely came from the fact that there were so many women involved with the church, and that they influenced and they were part of being able to give their lives to the church to avoid remarriage. The idea of having daughters turn into to virgins. There's some Greek history in that. There was certainly like the Vestal virgins, and there's some mythology about that and stuff like that. But for most people, the idea of being a virgin, becoming a nun, for example, was probably not all that prevalent. But for older women who had means, and as widows, this was one way in which these women could remain celibate, and not remarry, because they had almost a religious exemption. There are examples of where Judaism had religious exemptions in Roman society. This may have been seen as part of that too, and that Paul allowed that. So here we have this woman who fits in the social context, only fits in the narrative here if she has wealth, if she's connected, if she's literate, and if she's a widow. So when we go and we look a little further here, then we can kind of get a little bit more of a picture too, is that as you go to verse 3, Paul says, say hello to Prisca, who is also Priscilla, same person, and Aquila. Whenever you see that female-male pair, that's almost always a married couple. So the only thing that's weird here is that the woman is mentioned first. This happens throughout. There's only one place in the New Testament where Priscilla and Aquila are mentioned in normal order, where the man's name is first. I believe that's in Acts. But I think Priscilla is mentioned 5 times. Very active, tons of teaching Apollos, teaching very one of the more mentioned women in the Bible, in the New Testament. And only Mary Magdalene and Mary, mother of Jesus, was mentioned more. And then he goes, my co-workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their own necks for my life. I'm not the only one to give thanks to God for them, but all the churches of the Gentiles do the same. So, just absolutely crucial to the mission, and they mostly worked in Ephesus and in Greece, probably over by Corinth as well. And so here we have prominent woman clearly teaching, because we see how she taught Apollos. And it says, also say hello to the church that meets in their house. So they had a house church. Say hello to Ephanetus, my dear friend, who was the first to convert in Asia for Christ. Say hello to Mary. We don't know exactly which Mary this is, who has worked very hard for you. Already 3, maybe 4 women. Then the very interesting one, say hello to Andronicus and Unia, my relatives and my fellow prisoners. They are prominent among the apostles. They were in Christ before me. Now, I've actually talked about Unia before, and she's a real touchstone for a lot of people who are, in feminist and womanist interpretations of Scripture. And Unia has been blotted out of Scripture a number of times by making her into a male, by changing the ending of her name, and it's just completely fallacious that was done. But the reason why people wanted to do that is they didn't like the fact that Andronicus, who's clearly a masculine name, and Unia, probably a married couple, but they don't like the fact that Unia, my relatives and my fellow prisoners, were prominent as apostles. I say as because if you look at the Greek, that word "in" could be among, could be as, could be with, it's a very flexible preposition. In context, especially when Paul says they were in Christ before me, he's praising them, and he's saying that they have prominence before them. And he's saying that as apostles, now he wouldn't just say that they are famous to the apostles, which is what I would call misogynistic, traditional, patriarchal translations like the ESV and the NASB, for example, use. They say the NASB is particularly egregious on this. Everybody talks about the NASB being word for word, but it's only word for word when it's convenient. When it comes to passages like this, when it clearly says the words in Greek say to be famous or prominent among or as or with or whatever the apostles, they literally that's very literal when you look at the Greek. But then the NASB, because they're very uncomfortable with this association of Unia and apostle, those two words, they put distance between those two, the name and apostles, by saying that they were well known to the apostles, or they were, and it's just crazy. It's all because they did not want Unia to be an apostle, but it's highly likely that she was. There was no other way to explain why this word usage is the way it is and why Paul is praising him. Paul didn't care what the other apostles thought about his co-workers. He was concerned about his people that he's working with. The whole narrative, the whole part of Romans 16 is all about praising the people that work with him closely. But he didn't care what Peter thought, or Thomas or Bartholomew or whatever. He didn't give a darn what they thought about Unia. It was the people that mattered to them. So yes, Unia is an apostle, almost certainly. So that's where this is so important from a biblical studies point of view. A typical reader, a typical pastor, is not going to have this insight by themselves. A typical, especially with patriarchy, patriarchal Christianity that we've had for so long, they're going to be uncomfortable and avoid these kind of associations because they have hundreds, they have thousands of years of pushing women aside ever since the 2nd century. When women started becoming very prominent in the church, that's when some of the people that we call church fathers started pushing women aside. And especially when the church became an imperial, associated with imperial power, with Constantine and afterwards, that's when you really see it, that women were pushed aside. But you have to give credit to those translators and the people who wrote the manuscripts to be true to the text. They kept it in there. So they may have, played games with the words, like I mentioned the NASB does, for example. But, you can't deny what was the Greek manuscripts. And we have so many Greek manuscripts nowadays, we have a pretty good idea. And when we find new Greek manuscripts and discover them, we find that they're pretty consistent. There's differences, but you can see that it makes sense and you start putting together. So this is where biblical scholarship is so important, because we have been clouded by and every generation does this, of course. They have their own interpretations and so forth. But we have so much more information today than people had 100 years ago. Just vast amounts and more. We have it both in linguistically, because there's so much study that's been done. We have, archaeological discoveries happening all the time. And then what we also have is we have a lot more cultural history. So we understand how women were treated in various situations in ancient societies and so forth. So when you put these things together, you begin to get a clearer picture. And that's what's happening. We're in a golden age right now in biblical studies. And I really hope that we can continue to do that and not let those forces that are acting against them, and there are many anti-intellectual forces in Christianity trying to shove scholarship aside or only approving a certain kind of scholarship. You definitely see that in translation, right? So that's why it's important. Now, when I am studying Romans and I'm writing a series of sermons for this summer on Romans, just absolute gold mine and amazing things to study here. I've been using a new commentary done by Beverly Roberts Gaventa that came out in 2024. There's some other texts, and I've talked about that in other podcast episodes that I've done. That there's a lot of Roman scholarship going on right now, and it's exciting and it's cool. Well, the very interesting thing about Gaventa's, who's like a top scholar, top Roman scholar, was one of the leaders of the SBL, the Society of Biblical Literature, among other things. She, in her commentary, constantly talks about the letter delivered by Phoebe throughout the commentary. And she does that to personalize the fact that as this letter was being read to people, and as she's going through all the various interpretations of the various parts of the book of Romans, she personalizes it, meaning Gaventa personalizes it by saying Phoebe meant this, or Phoebe's likely purpose in saying this. The other thing that's part of this too, in biblical scholarship, there's a lot of discussion about who the authors were of these epistles, because these epistles are complicated and they're big, and they needed scribal work. They needed editing. They needed work. So one of the questions is how much editing happened with Paul and his entourage and his co-workers at the time. How much of the editing happened when the letters were being delivered? Because remember, Paul wasn't present. They were being read by others. And then how much of the editing was being done afterwards? either by the communities that received the letters or as the canon was being built and as the manuscripts started coming out. And you start seeing some of that. You can get clues of it by looking at manuscripts from different times. And the small differences could lead to bigger differences or be clues of bigger differences that happened before. Now, I'm not saying that the meaning changes greatly, but the emphasis matters because it tells you a lot about the relative importance of things. It tells you a lot about the book of Romans here. Certainly calling unia unias is not an ancient edit. That's an edit that happened way later because the Catholic Church was uncomfortable with women being associated with apostles. And but honestly, what's so amazing is that the King James Version has unia as a woman. Now, of course, they call her kinsman because they just can't get besides himself, but still as a woman. It was then American versions that came later, American translations that came later, or the ones that really put it down. And even by the RSV in the mid-20th century, unia as a man becomes unias. And then they use all this creative stuff about preposition, word order, and using the Greek to work against her being an apostle. Same thing has happened with Phoebe. Like I mentioned before, Phoebe, instead of being a deacon, was called a servant. But she's not a doulos. Doulos is servant as well. Doulos is slave. No, she was a deaconion. I may not be pronouncing it properly, but she's a deacon. She's not just a servant. She's a servant of the church as well, servant of the people. Same thing with a lot of translations, instead of saying sponsor or benefactor in verse 2, they'll use the word helper. Kind of like, maybe she's, baking cookies for them or something like that. No, the words that are used there are about money. She was providing financial support. And why would Paul say myself included unless he was talking about financial support? So again, the subtlety of how the words are used are very important and have been used against women in leadership for millennia. So that's why this description that Beverly Caventa is using in her commentary, and that what you're seeing more and more in new translations, but also in new biblical scholarship about the book of Romans, you can see that we're trying to undo the harm that was done. That's been done really, like I said, since the 2nd century, really, and trying to decipher the role of women in Paul's church. Nobody's ever going to say that Paul was an egalitarian, but you could say, because he's a 1st century Jewish and Roman citizen, right? But you can say that Paul relied on these women. Paul had a single-minded focus. You can tell in his personality. He was like anything for Jesus, anything to spread the word of Christ. I mean, it's like when he's on the Areopagus in Acts, and he's arguing with the Greeks, the Athenians. He's basically saying, "Look, your unknown God." He's using every argument he can in order to get people's attention, in order to be able to have them hear the gospel, hear the good news of Jesus. So you could say, even if Paul. We don't know what kind of person Paul was. He's a pretty well-rounded figure in Scripture, but whether Paul was misogynistic or thought women were equal or not equal or whatever, it doesn't matter. He definitely cooperated with them and depended on them. That's the point. And women definitely were reading the letters aloud. They were definitely teaching. They were definitely apostles. Apostle just means sent out. They were doing all of those functions. So That's why when people today start using Paul to say that women shouldn't be in the ministry or they're not qualified to be in it, I just laugh, because that just betrays the fact that you're not looking at the Greek, you're not looking at cultural history, and you're not reading what Paul's saying about the women that support him. So with that, I'll say it's very true in this case. People say lots of things about the Bible that aren't really there, and that's one of them. And Phoebe is this amazing person that if we only spend time trying to understand where she sits in the cultural hierarchy and the cultural system, only if we spend the time to really look at the language and Paul's purpose, then you'll see how crucial she was, and that she was probably an example of many other women. There may be many other women that we don't know about that supported Paul. Certainly there were. There are probably many other men that we don't know about that supported Paul and supported the mission and supported the church as it was spreading around the Mediterranean and through the centuries to us. So with that, I say thank you so much for listening. For those of you who are subscribing, please follow, please send this around. I really want to spread this wider. It's done pretty well so far, but I really appreciate your support and getting the word out. And with that, I say thank you and bless you.